evening, and thank you all for joining us for our lecture this evening. There looks like there are people still, they're coming in, so we'll give them a minute. But I just wanted to welcome everybody for joining us this evening. My name is Stephanie. I am the Public Programs Manager at the San Antonio Museum of Art. I want to point your attention to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So at the end of the lecture, we'll be taking a couple of Q&A questions depending on how much time we have left. So if something, wanted more information on something or had a question, please feel free to use that feature there. And also I wanted to note that lectures and artist conversations are made possible by the generous support from the Louis A. and Frances B. Wagner Lecture Fund. And with that, I will turn it over to Jessica Powers, who is the interim chief curator at the museum. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you all for joining us this evening. This year, the San Antonio Museum of Art is celebrating its 40th anniversary, and to mark the occasion, our fall exhibition, 40 Years, 40 Stories, Treasures and New Discoveries from SAMA's collection, features works from all areas of our collection, including the mosaic that you'll hear about this evening. Our speaker this evening, Dr. John Clarke, is Annie Laurie Howard Regents Professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Clarke is well known for his work on Roman art, including a groundbreaking book on the houses of Pompeii and Ostia Antica, and a series of books showing how investigations of visual representations in their original contexts can reveal the attitudes that ancient Romans had toward the practices of everyday life, including religion, work, recreation, humor, and sex. Since 2005, he has been co-director of the Aplantis Project to study two extensive buildings, a luxury villa and a wine bottling emporium, that were buried by the same eruption that covered Pompeii. In recognition of his significant contributions to the study of Roman art and archaeology, the Archaeological Institute of America awarded Dr. Clarke its 2017 Gold Medal for Distinguished Achievement in Archaeology. For his lecture this evening, Dr. Clarke will revisit the subject of his doctoral dissertation at Yale on the black and white figural mosaics of Roman Italy. His lecture is called The Perplexing Voyage of the San Antonio Marine Mosaic, Ostia Antica Travels to San Antonio. Dr. Clarke, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I turn it over to you.
Well, it's a pleasure indeed, and thank you so much for that nice introduction. I first saw the magnificent mosaics of Ostia Antica in 1970 at the beginning of a rather magical year of study in Italy as a Fulbright Fellow. One of my acquaintances had a car, and thinking selfishly about my dissertation project, I suggested the 15-mile trip to Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber. Although I had spent over a year studying the mosaics at Ostia from books, I had yet to visit the site. It was a fair day in November, and I remember the wonderful smell of salt air blowing in from the sea and the luxurious, soft, green winter grass covering the ancient Ostia Road as we entered the site. When I first climbed up to the second-story perch above the Baths of Neptune, I had to catch my breath, not because of the steep climb, but because of the size and beauty of the mosaics on the floor below. Little did I know that I would spend so much time over the next decades at Ostia as I developed my dissertation on black and white figural mosaics and then a book on the subject. Ostia became my second home in Rome as this huge site slowly yielded up its secrets. That was my virgin voyage from New Haven to Rome to Ostia Antica, a trip back to the 2nd century AD. My talk tonight is about a very different voyage, not of a person, but of an object that is now up on the walls of the exhibition 40 Years, 40 Stories, Treasuries and New Discoveries from SAMA's collection, on view through January 2nd. The wall label reads, modern copy of a mosaic depicting a Nereid in the Baths of the Seven Sages, Ostia, 20th century. I have a story as well about the first time I saw this mosaic. It was August 1980, and I had just arrived as a new assistant professor at UT Austin. I just ensconced myself in my new office, and the first call I received was from a gentleman who introduced himself as Gilbert Denman. I had heard about his collection from my new colleagues, and apparently he had done some research on me as well. He invited me to see that collection, housed mainly in a 4-story apartment building above a restaurant on the Riverwalk. I particularly remember the entrance to the stairwell, large but completely filled with a colossal statue of Emperor Marcus Aurelius. On that long afternoon, I had the pleasure of speaking about nearly every object in that enormous collection, but I could not say anything about the mosaic. Why? Because I immediately realized that it was not authentic, but that it had to have been created in the fairly recent past. In this talk, we will be looking at the mosaic very carefully as I lay out all the reasons why it cannot be an authentic Roman mosaic. I'll begin with the 2 black and white mosaics at Ostia that served as models. Then I'll delve into the process that the modern mosaicists used to copy the images we see in the mosaic. And finally, I'll take you through a close examination of the back and front of the object, pointing out anomalies that cast doubt on its authenticity. Let's start with what made me reject the mosaic out of hand. In 1980, I just published my monograph on Roman black and white figural mosaics.
Sorry, John, did you want to go ahead and share your screen?
Oh my God. Should I go back? I think I should go back, huh? How did that happen?
Sorry, people are super excited to see the photo. So there we go. There we are.
Okay, I think what I'll do is, all right, folks, I'm so sorry because I wasn't sharing my screen. You missed this wonderful view of the Baths of Neptune at Ostia. And here's what I saw the first time I went to Ostia, as I just described. A beautiful mosaic of Neptune and more mosaics on the other side. This is the mosaic that I saw for the first time in Mr. Denman's collection on the Riverwalk. This is the Marcus Aurelius that I spoke about, and now I'm caught up. Good heavens. Let's start with what made me reject the mosaic out of hand. In 1980, I just published my monograph on Roman black and white figural mosaics, and so I knew exactly where the primary image of a Cupid riding 2 marine horses came from. Room D of the Baths of the 7 Sages at Ostia. This figural group greets the viewer entering the room from the north at the blue arrow. To the right of the arrow, you can see the ladder the photographer is standing on, and even the photographer's shoes. These baths form part of a major luxury apartment building. In this Google Earth view, I have outlined these baths. In the drawing, you can see the largest mosaic, a wonderful composition with concentric vine scrolls that decorates the rotunda, with the mosaic of room D sketched in below. Here's a view from the entrance to the rotunda where you can see how the vegetal scroll surrounds images of human hunters and their prey, a motif often called the populated vine scroll. Scholars have dated it to about 130 based on the refinement of the design and associated architecture. In contrast, the mosaic of room D that served as the model for the San Antonio mosaic belongs to a later restructuring of the heated rooms to the south, about 100 years later, between 230 and 235. What about the other motifs in the San Antonio mosaic? Another mosaic at Ostia, also dated between 200 and 235, furnished models for 3 other images. It's an L-shaped mosaic that paved the corridors and a little courtyard of a partially excavated apartment building in another part of Ostia. As you can see in the slide, the building is right near the city gate of the road that led, and still leads today, to Rome. On this gate on the Google image is labeled Porta Romana. You can see it over here, or Rome Gate. Excavators called this apartment building the Caseggiato del Cane Monas, or the apartment building of the dog Monas, in recognition of the label of the little rearing dog that greeted someone coming in the door. We shot this overhead view in 1979. Today, the mosaic is covered, awaiting restoration. In this slide, I've circled the motifs that the maker of the San Antonio mosaic appropriated from the mosaic of the apartment building of the dog Monos. The first motif is of a simple fish swimming towards Monos. The second is the seahorse that appears in the lower right of the San Antonio mosaic. Whereas the swimmer pulls the seahorse along in the dog Monos mosaic, the mosaicist who appropriated the image for the San Antonio mosaic left out the swimmer and the reins. Finally, we have a group of a dolphin about to snatch an octopus with a sea urchin above the pair. The mosaicist eliminated the sea urchin and turned this group from a vertical to a horizontal orientation in the San Antonio mosaic. So far, I have identified the motifs that the mosaicists appropriated from these two pavements at Ostia to create the San Antonio mosaic, except for the little fish swimming from left to right in the upper corner of the panel. One day, I'm sure I'll recognize it in another mosaic at Ostia. But more importantly, I haven't explained just why the direction of all the motifs in the San Antonio mosaic are flipped 180 degrees left to right. This change in direction is my best indication, my best clue, for it reveals the technique the mosaicists used to carry out these unusually faithful but mirror reversed copies of the originals. A mosaic consists of individual cube-shaped stones called tesserae. This name comes from the Latin word for dice. As you can see in this slide, mosaic tesserae come in a variety of sizes. On the left, I've placed the tesserae according to size. The scale marker at the bottom gives us 10 centimeters or close to 4 inches. As you can see, the smallest tessera at right is just about half a centimeter square. The largest in this row is a single black tessera with a face of about 7/10 of a centimeter square. I stipulate the face of the tesserae, or the top part of the tesserae, because as you can see, these same tesserae laid on their sides vary in depth. The black one in the middle, for instance, is nearly 3 centimeters deep. See it right there. Moving to the upper row, on the left, we see a group of 4 white tesserae, large ones, face up, and on the right, 3 other large white tesserae. Both are still stuck together with the original mortar or grout. Between these groups of tesserae is a single black tessera that measures 1.2 centimeters on its face. When we turn these tesserae on the sides, we see that rather than having a cube shape, the tesserae are 2 to 3 times longer than on their faces. Roman mosaicists working with these larger tesserae do not seem to have been bothered by making perfect cubes, but were content to push the parts that didn't show into the cement. One advantage of these deep tesserae is that they are much harder to dislodge than the shallow-laid cubic ones. Particularly for floor mosaics, it was important that the surface be smooth. We know from ancient sources that after a mosaic dried thoroughly, mosaicists smoothed the surface using pumice as an abrasive. Now that we've looked at the tesserae, the individual elements that make up a mosaic, we need to look at the 2 basic methods for laying tesserae to make a mosaic, the direct and the indirect or reverse method. By far, the most common and easiest method is the direct method. This was the method used by ancient mosaics. Here's an example taken from the webpage of Rod Humby, a modern mosaicist. In the upper left, we can see that the artist has drawn the design onto a backing board. In antiquity, as we shall see, the mosaicists either painted or scored their designs directly on the concrete of the floor. In the next step, the mosaicist cuts and shapes the tesserae to fill in the outlines. To keep the tesserae in place, Humby is using an adhesive. In ancient times, mosaicists probably used some sort of glue to keep the tesserae in order. Once the tesserae are all in place, the mosaicist fills the gaps between them by spreading mortar over the surface. and pushing it down into the interstices. He then removes the excess mortar by giving the surface a good scrubbing. With an ancient mosaic, as we mentioned, the polishing process removed this excess grout. Evidence for the use of the direct method sometimes appears when a mosaic is damaged, revealing the outlines of images traced on the cement layer. These can either be drawn on the cement base or scored into the cement before it dries completely. Here I'm showing you a partially falling mosaic from the Basilica of San Lorenzo Maggiore in Milan. It once covered the entirety of an apse, showing shepherds and their flocks. Today, the tesserae in the center part have fallen off, revealing the drawing that guided the mosaicists. Note the horses in the upper right part here. The heads of 3 of them exist only in the underdrawing, but the necks and chests of the same horses are still intact. This is the direct method. It turns out that the San Antonio mosaic was made using the indirect method, also called the reverse method. As the name suggests, the mosaic is built up on a temporary support, usually heavy paper. In step 1, the mosaicist traces his design on the paper, then glues the tesserae to the paper using a water-soluble glue, such as starch or flour paste glue. On the right, we see that the mosaicist has drawn the outlines of this figure on brown paper and is in the middle of gluing down the tesserae. In step 2, the mosaicist has finished laying the tesserae on the paper support and is in the process of covering the whole thing with bedding cement. Note in the drawing at the left that the artist suggests a fairly thin coating of about 1/4 of an inch, and also the note, fill the interstices. This means that the mosaicist has to work the mortar into the gaps between the individual tesserae at this stage. Step 3 occurs after that cement bedding dries completely. It is time to attach the mosaic to its final support, labeled final mounting surface in the drawing at the left. Today, many mosaicists use lightweight supports like polymer resin panels rather than cement, as we find in the San Antonio mosaic. But whatever material the mosaic is bedded in, it's important to attach it with mortar. This is why the note at the bottom says scratch coat of mortar. At the right, we see step 4. The mosaicist soaks the brown paper to dissolve the glue, making it possible to remove the paper temporary support, and reveal the finished front of the mosaic. One of the advantages of this method is that it should create a mosaic with a flat, even surface, since the tesserae have been glued down to the temporary paper support. All the irregularities are hidden within the concrete. The final step is like the final step in the direct method, where the mosaicist spreads mortar grout over the surface to fill in the interstices or gaps between the individual tesserae. There are several indications that the creator of the San Antonio mosaic used the indirect method. The first is the fact that all the figural motifs are, as we have already seen, reversed or flipped laterally 180 degrees. This means that the guidelines on the temporary support were copied straight from the original without compensating for the fact that they would end up reversed right to left in the resulting mosaic. There were 2 ways the maker of this mosaic could have copied the motifs. The hard way would have been to make direct one-to-one replicas by placing tracing paper on the original mosaics of the Baths of the 7 Sages and the apartment of the dog Monas. I've actually done this using transparent mylar, and it is a pain. It's a lot of work. In the case of tracings, they would have to be sized down because the motif of the Cupid riding the hippocampus measures 200 by 303 centimeters in the original, but only 62 by 118 centimeters in the copy in the San Antonio Museum. Also, the individual making the tracings would have had to have obtained a permission from the site supervisor. And that would have taken a lot of fancy explanation. Here is an illustration of the second, much easier method. It seems likely that the mosaicist had at his disposal the fourth installment of the series, Scavi di Ostia, or Excavations at Ostia, subtitled Mosaics and Marble Pavements. It appeared in a lavishly illustrated large format edition in 1961, just 3 years before an antiquities dealer offered Mr. Denman the mosaic. The author of Excavations at Ostia, Mosaics and Marble Pavements, was the eminent scholar Giovanni Beccati, who had dedicated a significant part of his career to studying and cataloging all the mosaics found at the site of Ostia. There are 2 volumes, one the catalog itself and the other consisting of excellent black and white photographs. I believe that the person who created the San Antonio mosaic copied these 2 source mosaics I've identified from the volume of plates using black and white slide film. He projected the slides onto the heavy paper support using a slide projector. Note the size of the paper is the same size as the finished mosaic, about 1 by 2 meters. Sizing the individual motifs would not be difficult, a major obstacle if he had been working from a one-to-one tracing. By moving the projector closer or farther away, the mosaicist was able to place all the motifs in the mosaic where he wanted them and at a size that fit the 1 by 2 meter format. Here, I've taken the largest motif, that of the Amarino riding a biga of hippocamps, and sized it to approximate this motif in the San Antonio Marine mosaic. Once the mosaicist had projected and drawn the motifs he wanted onto the paper support, all that was needed was to set the tesserae. For this step, the artist, of course, would place the paper with the drawings of figures on a work table and then would lay the black and white tesserae within the outlines. I show you here how I established the measurements of the figure of the Amarino riding the hippocamps from the Baths of the 7 Sages. As I happened to be in Rome at the beginning of October, I went to Ostia and placed a tape measure over what is left of the unfortunate original. Although the mosaic was consolidated after its discovery in 1940, lack of proper protection from the elements has resulted in the loss of many tesserae, especially the black ones. The black tesserae are made of basalt, a volcanic stone, and are harder than the white ones made from white limestone or marble. But for some reason, they tend to get dislodged from the cement bed more easily than the white ones. Here I show you the plate from Beccati's book of the right half of the mosaic as it was around 1960. It is more complete and all of the black tesserae are in place. This shot, taken at the same time as the previous one, but at an oblique angle, gives you a better idea of the extent of the losses today. There are other anomalies in the San Antonio mosaic that belie its modern origin. The first has to do with the color of the stone used for the white tesserae. To the eye of someone who has looked at black and white mosaics at Ostia, the stones in the San Antonio mosaic are hardly white. They vary from light to dark beige. In contemporaneous black and white mosaics from Ostia, like this one from the Forum of the Corporations, the tesserae are uniformly white. Let me show you a detail. Here, in an area along the left-hand side of the mosaic, we can see a wide range of colors of the background, including a cool gray, which registers as white-ish from a distance, but there are also warm grays, a sort of putty color, and a range of brown tesserae ranging from dark brown to beige. Although the interspersed beige tesserae throughout the mosaic still allow a viewer to register the ground as white, in fact, very few of the tesserae are pure whites. Particularly in this spot, the mosaicist employed tesserae that can't pass for white or even beige. In the center of this detail, they range from medium to dark brown. In hue, the darkest of these tesserae get uncomfortably close to the black tesserae used to make up the silhouettes and the frame. In fact, the frame is also problematic. It consists of two straight rows of black tesserae, meeting the modern steel edging, with a third row of alternating black and white tesserae. As far as I know, this simple sawtooth pattern is never used for framing ancient mosaics at Ostia, where a 3 to 6 tessera wide frame uniform on the inboard and outboard sides is standard. There are also anomalies in the pattern of laying the tesserae in the white ground. At the point where I've placed the red line, the mosaicist changed the direction of his rows of tesserae, whereas the white rows proceed in a fairly regular horizontal fashion up to this line. To the right of the line, they begin to run from top to bottom. You can see the shift in pattern of laying the tesserae in the detail on the right. Generally, ancient mosaics try to make the pattern of the tesserae making up the white background unobtrusive. And the best way to do this was to adhere to the grid pattern. In the San Antonio mosaic, this pattern breaks down not only at the right side of the mosaic, but also at the left, although the area of the changed alignment is smaller. My final observation about the laying of the tesserae has to do with areas of concavity. This is particularly puzzling considering that the mosaicist used the indirect method. Mosaicists made with this method usually end up very flat and uniform in surface, since the mosaicist glues the tesserae to the heavy paper support itself lying on a uniform flat surface. In this photo, we see a heavy shadow line beneath a row of tesserae. The tesserae above this line protrude beyond the tesserae below it. In this photo taken at a raking angle, we recognize that the mosaicist has left a rather large depression in this area, located above and to the left of the galloping seahorse. A reason for this anomalous depression comes to mind if we go back to our image comparing surface and side views of ancient tesserae. If we hypothesize that the mosaicist acquired ancient tesserae, as I think likely, they came from pavements made using the direct technique. In the direct technique, when you have very deep tesserae like the ones in the top, interspersed with purely cubic ones, it doesn't affect the final surface. Why? Because a mosaicist, given an irregular bunch of tesserae, will calculate the thickness of the mortar layer based on the longest tesserae he has to use. The extra depth simply gets hidden in the mortar. All that matters is the top surface. And the workman will smooth and level that surface after the whole mortar matrix has completely dried and set. But if the mosaicist had to use a combination of deep and cubic tesserae, cheek by jowl, in the indirect method, there is the possibility that the long ones might tilt or even fall like dominoes after he glues them to the paper support. They will stick out and are likely to shift when it's time to fill up the interstices with mortar. It seems that something like that happened with the concavity we just looked at in the San Antonio mosaic, since at the top of the concavity there is a uniform row of 10 tesserae, as we saw, that stand even with the surface. But the trouble begins just below that uniform line, where a group of tesserae must have come unglued from the paper support. In the detail, you can see that as well, that whereas the tesserae making up the row all show a regular square shape, below that line, there are gaps without tesserae at all that are filled with cement, and tesserae that are anything but regular in shape. Let's talk about the possible sources for the tesserae used to create the San Antonio marine mosaic. If we place the date of its manufacture between the publication of the photographs of the mosaics of Ostia in 1961 and June 1964, when it was offered to Mr. Denman, there were lots of ancient mosaic tesserae to be had, especially in Rome. The post-war building boom moved beyond the city walls and into the countryside, transforming open fields into huge apartment complexes. Much of this land covered ancient buildings paved with mosaics. Once uncovered, an ancient mosaic will not last long without expensive and difficult work of lifting the mosaic and placing it on a new backing. I've heard tales of contractors deliberately destroying damaged mosaics and getting rid of the evidence, that is, the tesserae, by either burying them or selling them. It seems to me that the San Antonio mosaic is made of ancient tesserae from a single site where the stone used was not the usual pure white. Looking closely at the white tesserae, you can also make out signs of wear, even what look like tool marks. Modern tesserae, thanks to carbon steel saw blades, have smooth surfaces on all sides. The black tesserae as well in the San Antonio mosaic show an unusual amount of abrasion on their surfaces, and some have accretions of white mortar or lime deposits. You have been looking at two areas of the San Antonio mosaic where I counted the number of tesserae within a 20 by 20 centimeter square. The purpose of this exercise was to find the average tessera size, both in the white ground and in an area with figuration. We come up with an average tessera size between 1.2 and 1.4 centimeters square. Note in the detail at the right that not all the tesserae are square. In order to make the internal white lines, the mosaicists had to cut the white tesserae in half. Now let's step back and look at the support for the mosaic. In this view, taken from the top right, we see the original painted steel frame that surrounds the mosaic. U-shaped brackets secured to the wall surround that steel frame. Looking at the back of the mosaic, we see that the steel frame wraps around to form a lip over the edges of the cement back. Given the weight of the piece, it's no wonder that the workman who framed it ran two other pieces of steel from top to bottom. In the two red boxes I've drawn on the left, you can see some of the slightly rusty steel of one of those supports popping through the gray cement backing. That backing must have been added after the cement of the mosaic had set. In the blue box at the right, I show you a streak due to a second vertical steel support leaching through this added gray cement layer. In this detail, you can see how that gray cement seems to have been slathered onto for the purpose of covering the slightly rusted angle iron frame. An amusing artifact in the newspapers that must have originally covered all the gray cement is this little astrological chart that gives us the date of the page was printed in early July 1964. The dealer, Alfredo Turchi, owner of a gallery in Rome specialized in ancient art, first offered the mosaic to Mr. Denman, as I mentioned earlier, in June 1964, and in a letter dated September 9th, 1964, Turchi announces that the mosaic has been shipped to San Antonio. Given this information, it seems that the gray mortar with the newspapers stuck on top was an unsuccessful attempt to clean up the back of the mosaic. In places, as we've seen, the gray cement did not adhere, leaving some of the rusty steel in evidence, and efforts to tear the newspaper off the cement were not very successful either. Let's look more closely at the information concerning the provenance or history of ownership of the mosaic that we can glean from the letter of 9 September 1964. It is an interesting, but now we know, patently false story of its origins. Turchi claims that the mosaic came from an undisclosed location near Ostia and that it was found in 1940. This is 1 year after the 1939 law on cultural heritage that declared every ancient object found to be state property. Only an origin in a private property could give the buyer some protection for the transaction. However, we know it's a copy, and Turchi certainly could have held regular export papers for the mosaic that said it was a modern copy. In that case, nothing illegal would have been involved, other than the fact that this letter is a false declaration to Mr. Denman that it was ancient and dating to the 2nd century. Turchi's account of the mosaic's travels after it was found is nothing short of bizarre. He states that the mosaic was in the castle of Mignano Montelungo, far south of Rome, and in the possession of the last noble heir, Maria Elena Nunziante, who married Lord Benjamin Guinness in 1939. We know from a local historian, Giuseppe Angelone, that although the Duchess and Lord Guinness had fully restored the 11th century castle immediately after their marriage, it was soon again in peril, since the town of Mignano became a staging area for the terrible 5-month period when Allied troops were attempting unsuccessfully to advance against the German forces installed above Mignano in and around the great Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino. As you may know, after 4 unsuccessful assaults by the Allies between January and May 1944, the abbey was destroyed by bombing. So was the castle of Mignano, as you can see in the photograph in the lower left. Like the great abbey of Monte Cassino, the castle stands again, beautifully restored. We can return to that. But why does Alfredo Turchi attribute ownership of the San Antonio mosaic to the Nunziante family? Although it may be a coincidence, historians tell us that between 1939 and the death of Lord Guinness in 1947, the castle was under the administration of a certain Signor Turchi. Was this Alfredo Turchi himself or a relative? The other interesting confabulation in Alfredo Turchi's letter to Gilbert Denman is that during the war, the mosaic was sent to the National Archaeological Museum in Naples for safekeeping. The history of the often desperate wartime measures to protect works of art today is well known thanks to Robert Edsall's popular books about the monuments men. In the 1960s, the memory of all this was still fresh, and the idea that the mosaic was ancient and therefore needed protection among all the ancient works of art in the Naples Archaeological Museum seems to be an attempt to give credence to its authenticity. Another proof that Turchi adds to stress once again that the mosaic is not state property is that after the war, the mosaic was returned to the owner, a person who is not stipulated. The obvious person would be the widow of Lord Guinness, Duchess Maria Elena Nunziante, who died in 1974. But in this letter, Turchi simply states that the mosaic was bought from a noble family. They have sold it now and do not want to expose their name. Now, I've led you on a wild goose chase, but that is exactly what Alfredo Turchi has ingeniously and somewhat unbelievably created for the buyer, Gilbert Denman. His declaration of authenticity is in reality a short story meant to create an exciting history for the San Antonio mosaic. How can we get closer to the truth? Who made the copy? I will offer you several possibilities. My first idea was that one of the mosaic restorers at Ostia, at the site of Ostia itself, created the San Antonio mosaic to make some extra cash. From the earliest excavations in the 19th century to the present day, the archaeological site has employed a team of men specialized in repairing mosaics. These workers were capable of making copies of mosaics by working from one-to-one tracings made with translucent paper placed on the mosaic surface. I show you on the left a real tour de force of this technique, the tracings made of the two mosaics of the enormous Baths of Neptune. Because at the time of its discovery around 1900, it was impossible to photograph the mosaic from above, the site director, Guido Calza, employed the famous architect Italo Gismondi to trace the entire mosaic. Gismondi then reduced his drawings. The Neptune room alone measures 59 by 34 feet, and then overlaid them with photographs of the mosaics. This grainy reproduction from Calza's publication allows you to see the seams between the pieced together overlaid photographs. Now, this is a lot of work, not only tracing the mosaic on the floor, but reducing the tracings to a manageable scale. As you've already heard, I abandoned the idea that our copyist used one-to-one tracings to compose our mosaic after I corresponded with a contemporary mosaicist working in Rome, Fabio Bordi. It was he who suggested that the San Antonio mosaic was composed using the photographs from Beccati's book projected onto the wall. As we saw, in that process, it was not necessary to scale the drawings by hand, as Gismondi, for instance, had to do for the Neptune mosaics. Simply changing the distance between slide projector and the wall took care of that. Using slides also allowed the artists to easily mix motifs from the two different mosaics we have studied. In another rather wonderful coincidence, it turns out that Mr. Bordi himself has actually produced a copy for sale as such of the central group of the San Antonio mosaic. Note that in this case, Bordi went to the trouble of reversing the drawing so that the figures in his copy could swim from left to right as in the original in the Baths of the Seven Sages. Bordi has made copies of a large selection of Ostian mosaics. Just to give you an idea of the currency of making copies still for the black and white mosaics of Ostia, I show you a work by Rita Benzoni. Again, I immediately recognize this head presented in Benzoni's title as a Roman consul, as a part of mosaic depicting the winds and the provinces from partially excavated bath building underneath the Baths of Neptune. This explains the consul's weird hairdo, not hair at all, but actually wings attached to his head. He is, after all, personification of the wind. Let's return, however, to the circumstances of our mosaic's creation. I have proposed a narrow date between 1961 and 1964, but it turns out that the first half of the 20th century in Italy saw lots of copies, not only of mosaics, but of nearly all the artifacts associated with the glory of the Roman Empire. In 1911, 11 years before Mussolini rose to power, an international exposition housed copies of a host of ancient Roman artifacts in the great Baths of Diocletian in Rome. The plan of the exhibition stressed the Roman Empire's wide reach. There are rooms dedicated to all the Roman provinces, a not so subtle reference to the idea that Italy could create a new Roman Empire through colonial wars. In 1922, Mussolini actually declared a new Roman Empire, and his ministers looked for ways to promote it. They pressured Guido Colza, head of the excavations at Ostia, to speed up excavation and restore Ostia as an example of what they called Romanità, or Romanness, a catch-all code word for a new cultural directive based on Roman-style imperialism. One of the major takeaways for visitors to Ostia, in addition to the acres of buildings dating mostly to the 2nd century, was the huge number of black and white mosaics. Little wonder that the production of both copies and originals of black and white mosaics was central to a well-orchestrated program of what the fascists called public instruction. A second major exhibition featuring many copies of mosaics, both from Ostia and elsewhere, the Mostra Augustea della Romanità, or the Augustan Exhibition of Romanness, opened in 1937, and many of these, as well as a bewildering number of reproductions, sculptures, paintings, and objects of everyday life, were slated to appear in an even larger international exhibition planned for 1942, but never inaugurated because of the war. Black and white figural mosaics became shorthand for ancient Rome and its glories. The fascists sponsored huge building projects throughout the city of Rome and expected architects to use black and white mosaics as propaganda. Here we see just two of many examples. On the left is one of a group of mosaics paving a train station constructed expressly to welcome Adolf Hitler when he visited Mussolini in Rome in 1938. It shows a map of the Roman Empire, that's here, framed by a triumphal arch and a triumphal Roman general. This is modeled on the Augustus of Prima Porta. The mosaic on the right paved the Foro Mussolini, Mussolini's forum, with a very clear message. The forum was later renamed to the Italic Forum after Mussolini's fall. In the post-war period, there must have been a fairly large number of mosaic artists capable of crafting the San Antonio marine mosaic. There were mosaicists who worked both on big fascist-sponsored projects like the Ostia train station and the Mussolini Forum, as well as more modest private commissions. The maker of the San Antonio mosaic need not have been one of the staff mosaicists of the archaeological site of Ostia. He or she could have been schooled in mosaic making in the heyday of the 1930s and still making mosaics in early 1960. There was plenty of mosaic work being done after the war as well. The most immediate example that comes to mind is the mosaic-covered ceilings of Mazzoni's huge central train station, the Stazione Termine, completed in 1951. Mosaics were also integral to the decoration of many apartment complexes built in the post-war area. Builders chose mosaics as a relatively economic solution to the decorative needs and were particularly prized for their durability in public spaces. Since we don't know how the San Antonio mosaic actually came into Alfredo Turchi's hands, it is impossible to determine the maker's intentions. He or she may have conceived it as a tourist item, a modern piece meant to evoke the many marine mosaics decorating the baths at Ostia. There are other gaps in our knowledge as well, which I have tried to fill with hypotheses, such as the probable origin of the tesserae used to make it, the use of the slide projector to copy the motifs, and the origins of Turchi's fictive account of the mosaic's authenticity and provenance. Despite being a modern creation, the mosaic has taken me back to Ostia once more, either actually or in the mind's eye. It's been a stimulus to think about the combination of elegance and abstraction of black and white mosaics when they dominated the decoration of Roman buildings, both public and private, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. This was a style for the sophisticated capital of the great Roman Empire. In the provinces, patrons tended to prefer polychrome pavements that did not involve reducing the rendering to black silhouettes with white internal lines to delineate the anatomy of the figures. In the old days, some scholars proposed that black and white mosaics were a cheap alternative to mosaics rendered with a full color palette. But that is a difficult position to maintain when we think about grand spaces like the Baths of Neptune, built by none other than the Emperor Hadrian himself and dedicated by his successor in the year 139. You've been looking at a shot from my 3D model of the Baths of Neptune. And when I look at the walls in the model, I imagine expensive colored marble sheathing. Nearly all marble wall sheathing was robbed away in antiquity, attested only by holes in the walls where the bronze attachment clamps once were. Perhaps it was the desire for contrast that sparked the fashion for black and white mosaic floors. They would have been an excellent foil for a wall decoration with brightly colored marbles. Comparing the mosaics of the Baths of Neptune with a large room with a polychrome marine pavement at the 4th century villa of Piazza Marina in Sicily, I'm struck by how busy it looks and how it lacks the sense of flow evident in the Neptune mosaic. Once again, I also note that part of the back wall still retains some of its sheathing in plain gray marble. Once again, a contrast, but this time between a busy colored floor and a rather drab marble sheathing on the walls. Unfortunately, ancient sources give us no clues about what sparked the fashion for black and white mosaics. What is certain is that Sama's mosaic has launched me on an ongoing voyage of discovery that I've been very happy to share with you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clarke, for that really fascinating lecture. And those of you listening, if you have questions that you'd like to put into the Q&A, Dr. Clarke has agreed to take some this evening. The first question that was posted asks if Mr. Denman had worked with this dealer before or after he purchased the mosaic. And I don't know if you'd like me to speak to that.
Yeah, I would know.
Sure. So he first seems to have worked with this dealer in 1963, I think when he was actually traveling in Rome. He did buy quite a few works in 63 and 64 and continuing up until the early 1970s. I believe this is the only mosaic that he purchased from the same gallery. But most of the other works are sculptures, several of which are on view in our Roman gallery right now at the museum. So the second question is, what was his reaction to hearing that it was a fake? So I never had the privilege of meeting Mr. Denman, but Dr. Clarke, did you ever have the chance to talk to him about this?
No, I thought it was better to keep my mouth shut. and I just left it at that.
The next question is, could the grout or the mortar be identified or sourced in any way?
There's only one clue that would help, because mortar that was made in the modern period, particularly in the 50s and 60s, often had asbestos mixed with it. So we could look at the composition of the, kind of dig out some of the mortar and look at the composition of it. But that would have to be from the front of the mosaic, which would involve, removing some tesserae and so on. So it would be a slightly destructive. The other thing we can do is test the stones. We've done that for the sculptures and the stone elements of the Villa of Atlantis, which I've worked on for a long time, covered by the eruption of Vesuvius near Pompeii. And what comes out of analysis of stone, as opposed to mortar, is isotopic signatures. And they can be compared with the isotopic signatures of stones that are still in ancient quarries. However, I think in this case, it would only give us a very general answer. The problem with ancient quarries is a lot of them continue to be used, which means that if they're quarrying between, let's say, 100 and 1900, that's an awful big date range for the mosaic, for the stone. But if we had a quarry, let's say, that these stones came from, and it was definitely only used in antiquity, then we could say the stones were ancient, the tesserae were ancient. But I think, my best guess, as I've said, is that the tesserae themselves were ancient ones that were bought and reused.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions asking if Mr. Denman ever knew that it was a fake, and I think I don't think anyone ever discussed that with him. And when did the museum find out? And I think that was, I don't know, John.
It was a conversation with you.
Yeah, it was probably a conversation that we had maybe 15 years ago.
Oh my gosh.
I wondered if you have ever encountered another mosaic that's a forgery like this one?
I haven't, but it's not something that I've done very much work on. That would be a good avenue to explore, to see if anyone has written about it. One thing I belong to the International Association for the Study of Ancient Mosaics, and they publish a bibliography, and I have a bibliography. It's very well indexed because it's French, and French like to index things well. And I might be able to pull up some articles about ancient forgeries or forgeries of ancient mosaics. But I haven't done that research.
It seems because they're more cumbersome, perhaps something that's less likely to be faked than other kinds of objects.
Yeah, and the reduction of the imagery from the original down to a 1 by 2 meter size is a smart move, because it makes the object portable in a way that a full-size mosaic would not be. And when we restore mosaics, we have to section them, taking out the tesserae between the sections and putting them back after we're done. But you have to section them and then put new backing on them, and then put them back in the floor and fill in the gaps between the sections, because they're very heavy. They're hard to handle otherwise.
So we have a question also about the slide that you're showing right now that has the dog, and someone is curious about what kind of dog it is.
Oh, I
What
would
can you
love
tell
to
us about
know.
the dog?
I don't know much about breeds of dogs in antiquity. Let's see. Go back. I have a better shot of it. There he is, Monos. Maybe somebody has an idea. I can give you a very interesting bit of lore. It turns out that the famous "Beware the Dog" mosaic from the entryway to the house of the tragic poet at Pompeii shows a breed of dog, and in an excavation they found a hollow where a dog had been trapped in the ash, and they made a cast of it, and they claim to have identified the breed as the same breed as the dog that's pictured in the mosaic, the "Beware the Dog" mosaic. If you know that.
So someone in the Q&A has suggested that this dog looks like an Italian Mastiff. There you go.
Looks kind of pudgy for a Mastiff, but I don't know.
Someone asked if there's a website where we can read more about the mosaic. The mosaic is posted on the museum's website. There's a tab on our website for the collection where you can search, and there's an image for it there. There's not more information there than what Dr. Clarke has presented. He shared much more information in his talk tonight, but there are images there. There is a question. Someone is asking if any other objects donated by Mr. Denman have been found to be fakes. There is a piece of sculpture that is a torso of Venus of questionable date that I've published on others, but nothing that is as clear cut, I think, as the mosaic that we talked about this evening. And then there's also a question: why is it important to show a forgery in an exhibition? John, I don't know if you want to speak to why is it worthwhile to talk about something that's not ancient, or?
Well, for all the reasons that are presented here, it gets us into the history of Italy, basically. And not too many people outside of Italy know much about how black and white mosaics were used as a kind of symbol of Romanness and the ancient Roman Empire, and got put into so many buildings. One of the things I didn't mention that I could have is that Palazzo Venezia, which is the great palace, Renaissance palace in the next to the tomb of the Italian unknown soldier. It's called the Vittoriano, or the wedding cake. But anyway, the Palazzo Venezia has black and white mosaic pavements that were ordered by Mussolini when he lived there. So you get an idea of how dear this idea was to him. We can have mosaics just like the Romans. And of course, we look at something like this, and it's a lot of fun to think about how it was made and so on. So, I think it was a great idea to put it into this exhibition for those reasons.
And the exhibition also is exploring some of the stories behind the collection. This is the only work in this show that's not, or that we're aware of, that's not, of the date or period that it was purported to be. But that whole idea of that exhibition was to use the occasion to explore some different stories about conservation of works in the collection, research on works in the collection, sort of hidden features of some of the works that you might not otherwise know about. And so that's how it wound up being included in this particular show. All right. Well, thank you so much for your talk this evening. This is really fascinating. And we really appreciate your taking time to answer questions as well. So thank you so much. Really enjoyed it. And thank you to
I did too. It was a fun project.